And to everyone joining us, good afternoon to all of you. It's so good to see so many Turkish Americans in this room today. I thank you for your concern and your heartfelt prayers for Turkey, and also for your contributions to the United States. You're just model citizens, and we do appreciate it. The title of today's hearing poses a question of immense importance. Can Turkey find its way to freedom? Many people now fear that Erdogan's government may have taken Turkey near to the point of no return, that President Erdogan's government has left democratic institutions so weakened and power so concentrated that it will be very difficult to restore civil and political freedom in its most basic aspects: the rule of law, free and fair elections, judicial independence, religious freedom, and respect for internationally recognized human rights. But the answer to the question will be given by the Turkish people ultimately, although the guys with the guns and with the jails certainly have far too much to say. But there is hope, because the people of Turkey do want reform. The Turks are a famously courageous people. Throughout Turkey's modern history, men and women have defended democratic values, free institutions, and fundamental liberties, sometimes under very difficult circumstances, but they made progress. Today, many continue that work, but the situation has become far more difficult. Perhaps the most dramatic indication of this is the number of political prisoners currently in Turkey, estimated at well over 10,000, including journalists, lawyers, elected officials, academics, civil society leaders, democracy activists, as well as those imprisoned in abusive way due to counterterrorism laws. One of our witnesses, Sergen Golgay, will recount his own harrowing tale of such repression. A U.S. citizen, he was imprisoned by the Turkish government for nearly 3 years, much of it in solitary confinement. Turkish authorities treated lawful conduct, including his education, the innocent location of his bank account, family relationships, and even possession of a $1 bill, as evidence of terrorism. As he writes, quote, "The legal system that imprisoned me began with a conclusion and then searched backwards throughout my life for facts that they could be arranged to support such a bogus assertion." Even in the case of Turks abroad, standing up for freedom and the rule of law requires courage. One of the most disturbing features of the current situation is the government's record of transnational repression. Freedom House has repeatedly ranked Turkey among the world's most prolific perpetrators of transnational repression, targeting perceived opponents, critics, and dissidents, including Turkish Americans who have been subjected to surveillance, intelligence gathering, as well as pressure and intimidation and harassment. And who can forget when Erdogan was here on one trip to Washington, when his thugs went and beat protesters in Washington. I remember watching that and being sickened by that abuse of power. One of the hundreds of people in prison in Turkey today, perhaps one of the most high-profile individuals, is Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. He was one of the most popular leaders of political opposition in Turkey and a likely candidate for president. Few credit the independence of prosecutors and judges who arrested him and charged him with leading a criminal organization along with other opposition figures and elected officials. His arrest in March of 2025 came on the very day that his party was expected to nominate him as its candidate for the next presidential election. Since then, he has remained in prison while prosecutors have pursued a series of cases against him and his many associates. More than 400 of his supporters have been put on trial. This has marked a critical and ominous turning point. President Erdogan has previously refrained from arresting his principal electoral rival. We see parallels of that all over the world in dictatorships. In Nicaragua, when Ortega was running, he went and arrested all of his people, all the people that were filing to run against him. And we had hearings where we heard from the wives who told us they didn't know if their husbands were living or alive, living or dead, I should say. It was just awful. But that's how you vanquish your opposition. You throw them behind bars. This, more than anything else, prompts the question whether Turkey can find its way to freedom. The Turkish government appears to be moving from a system in which elections are unfair, but still winnable for the opposition, in one which Andrew O'Donoghue states in written testimony today, it has become increasingly doubtful that Turkey's government will allow voters to choose new leaders through elections. Our witnesses will address the increasingly systematic use of legal and administrative mechanisms to sideline political opponents, as well as heavy restrictions on freedom of expression, prosecution of journalists, blocking of online content blocking, criminalization of social media activity, and pressure on independent media. We will hear about the increasingly systematic use of state institutions to neutralize political oppositions and reconfigure the country to serve the, quote, political survival, the prerogatives, and the personal preferences of a single individual, as Henry Barclay testifies. Denial of religious freedom remains another serious problem. Crippling restrictions on Christian communities include the heavy interference in the internal life of the ecumenical patriarch and the continued closure of the Halki Seminary. Yet despite all of this, elections still matter in Turkey. Erdogan tilts the playing fields drastically, but opposition parties do compete, and very often they do win. The opposition today holds almost half of the seats in the Turkish parliament. Civic engagement remains strong, and the desire for an accountable government endures. As the administration prepares for the upcoming NATO summit in Ankara, I urge the administration to remind the Turkish government that freedom, rule of law, and democracy are also matters of alliance strength, stability, and security, as Michael Rubin warns in his testimony, and to meet with the Turkish parliamentary opposition. Strong allies require trusted courts, predictable legal institutions, and confidence that prosecutions are based on evidence rather than politics. Likewise, NATO allies are strongest when voters have genuine choices and when opposition parties can compete fairly. And likewise, effective counterterrorism requires transparent evidence for fair trials and public confidence in the justice system. So I look forward to this hearing from our witnesses, what the Turkish people can do, what we should be doing to defend their freedom and the best of their culture and national traditions from the abuses that we have seen in recent years. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Jim McGovern, co-chair of the Lantos Commission, for his comments.
Well, thank you, Co-Chair Smith, and good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on Turkey. You know, Hillary Clinton famously said, "It takes a village." I think I want to say it takes a bigger hearing room. I can't believe all the people that are here, but it shows the concern, the deep concern over what's happening in Turkey today. I note that the United Nations has accepted the country's request to use the term Türkiye, but I'm going to use the word Turkey today for ease of communication. This is the third year in a row that we have held a hearing on Turkey. These snapshots give us an opportunity to assess trends in human rights and democracy. And my impression is that things are getting worse. Human Rights Watch's 2026 report finds that the government of President Erdoğan, quote, consolidated its authoritarian trajectory with an unprecedented onslaught on the main political opposition, Republican People's Party, CHP, that threatened freedom of political association and free and fair elections, end quote. Amnesty International reports that the government weaponizes the criminal justice system against journalists. According to the Journalists Union of Turkey, 14 journalists and other media workers were in prison as of March 2026. Many more face intimidation. I hope our witnesses will update and analyze these trends. The government continues to refuse to adhere to binding judgments of the European Court of Human Rights to address serious human rights violations. I ask our witnesses to tell us why the Turkish government feels empowered to ignore its obligations. The announcement for this hearing asks for policy options available to the United States and Congress in support of democracy and human rights. But I wonder whether that is even possible anymore. How do we ask the executive branch to defend democracy in Turkey when the Trump administration eliminated democracy promotion as a component of our foreign policy? How do we ask the president to promote human rights in Turkey when his national security strategy doesn't even mention the words human rights, even once? How can we expect the administration to counter authoritarian consolidation in Turkey when the ruling party is actively and willingly consolidating authoritarianism in the United States? The V-Dem Institute's Democracy Report for 2026 assesses that the slide of autocratization in the United States has been more than twice as steep as Turkey's. The U.S. had the 8th biggest decline in its aggregate freedom score in Freedom House's 2026 report. So how can we credibly criticize the Turkish government's crackdown on political opposition when our Justice Department is ramping up efforts to investigate and prosecute President Trump's perceived enemies, according to the new Wall Street Journal investigation that lists more than 4 people targeted as Trump opponents? How do we call out Turkey for jailing journalists when our federal government is prosecuting reporters like Don Lemon and Georgia Fort? How can we convince Turkey to release Selahattin Demirtas, a prisoner of conscience jailed on a specious terrorism charge, when President Trump issues orders to prosecute domestic civil society groups as terrorist organizations? So let me be clear. I stand wholeheartedly with the witnesses here and with many others in wanting the government of Turkey to respect human rights and allow its citizens to enjoy their democratic freedoms. That is our message today. We are unified in that message. But my concern is that we, on the United States side, are undermining our capacity to advocate for the people of Turkey. You know, we often say that the problem is a matter of will. I'm worried that the problem now is more fundamental. It's a matter of ideology. So I'm going to continue to call for the people of Turkey to be able to exercise their fundamental rights under international human rights law, as I will join with Co-Chair Smith and not backing away from that one iota. These rights are universal, and they apply equally to the people of Turkey, China, El Salvador, the United States, and everywhere else. To erode the foundation of this system, for one, erodes it for all. So I thank the witnesses for being here. I thank members of the audience, many of who I've met over the years, for your courage and your bravery in speaking truth to power. I know that even though you're in the United States, that doesn't mean that you can escape intimidation from the Turkish government. And I know you have family members in Turkey, who are under great pressure for the advocacy that many of you adhere to here in the United States. I honor your commitment to human rights. I honor your courage. You give me hope. You're an inspiration. And I look forward to the witness's testimony. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished panel. We'll have a fuller record of your resume included in the record, but beginning with Henry Barkay is the Adjunct Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies, Council on Foreign Relations, Washington, D.C., and Professor of International Relations at Lehigh University. He has served on the U.S. Department of State Policy Planning staff as a Director of Middle East Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. In recent years, he has published articles on the subject of our hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee magazine. Michael Rubin, we welcome him back. He has been here before, and we always welcome his insights and incisive commentary. Is Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum and the editor of its daily Middle East Forum Observer. For over 22 years, he was a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the author of 6 books and more than 3,000 published opinion essays and articles on foreign policy, and frequently testifies before the House and the Senate, particularly on the Middle East, Africa, Southern Asia, and the Caucasus. Then we'll hear from Serkan Golgu, who is a Turkish-American scientist and former political prisoner. In 2016, in the aftermath of the failed coup attempt, as the government of Turkey used this as an opportunity to consolidate power and target perceived enemies, Mr. Golgu spent nearly 3 years in prison while his wife and children were prevented from returning to their home in the United States. He was eventually released from prison through sustained efforts by the United States government. We welcome him. Then we'll hear from Andrew O'Donoghue, who is the Carl J. Friedrich Fellow at Harvard University, a Fellow of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's an expert on politics in Turkey, including its legal and judicial system. His research has been published in the Journal of Democracy, the Middle East Journal, as well as other leading newspapers and magazines. So if we could begin with you, Mr. Barkay.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Since 2016, Turkey has been transformed into an illiberal state, one that may no longer even qualify as a competitive authoritarian regime. What has emerged over the past decade is not merely democratic backsliding in the abstract, but a system of personal rule, a regime increasingly organized around the political survival, institutional prerogatives, and personal preferences of a single individual, President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. The institutions of the Turkish state, its courts, prosecutors, broadcast regulator, central bank, electoral commission, and increasingly the constitution itself have become progressively shaped to function as instruments of one man's rule to ensure his continued hold on power. And yet, when he came to power in 2023, he came promising reforms and liberalization. So I will focus my remarks on 5 interrelated dimensions of the country's democratic regression. The first is the consolidation of personal rule around a single individual, what I call the architecture of one-man rule. Erdogan not only persuaded voters to approve a constitutional overhaul that concentrated extraordinary powers in the presidency, he also presided over the systematic weakening of all the institutions that might otherwise constrain, balance, or support executive authority. The office of the prime minister was abolished. Parliament is powerless. Powers are sharply diminished. Independent oversight bodies were hollowed out or brought under executive influence. As a result, meaningful checks and balances have largely disappeared. Periodic elections under increasingly unequal conditions are among the few remaining sources of political constraint on the system, but we see that that is also going to be removed as the regime is going after the main opposition party and has created an elaborate ruse to get rid of its current very active leadership. In this system, the presidency and the state have become increasingly fused. You may remember the old adage, l'état c'est moi. But it is also true that when you have a president with so much power, so much self-confidence, that he will make mistakes. And we saw one recently. And the mistake is both good and bad, because it's good in the sense that it was reversed, but it's also interesting in how overnight an edict gets released, a 2-line edict gets released, and the whole university, the big university in Istanbul, right in the middle of final exams and graduation, gets shut down, just like that, from one day to another. The reaction was actually quite severe. And just like you close it, you can open it up. So a 2-line statement, open it up. But it shows you, yes, you can have, you can resist, but at the same time, the power of the president is enormous. 2 is a systematic erosion of judicial independence and the rule of law. Erdogan's genius has been to fashion a judiciary to his liking. Following the attempted coup of 2016, some 4,400 judges and prosecutors, 1/4 of the bench, were purged by 2020. Judges and prosecutors function according to the palace's preferences. If they don't, there is a price to pay. At the very least, you get moved elsewhere, wherever Turkish Siberia is. As the saying goes, you can indict any kind of sandwich. So the judiciary is set to target anyone Erdogan personally targets. To me, the defining episode of arbitrary justice is the case of Osman Kavala. and it involves me, but I want to describe it because it is quite instructive. So Osman Kavala was indicted along with me for organizing the failed 2016 coup. The indictment is a total farce. Having read it numerous times, I can assure you that it provides no evidence, invents facts, and criminalizes ordinary activities, including travel and giving interviews to the press. It treats a 2-minute chance encounter at an Istanbul restaurant where I had gone to have dinner with a journalist 3 days after the coup actually occurred, as proof that we had been planning it all along. The indictment admits that they are unable to place us together, other than that time, but are nonetheless certain we plotted together. Why? This is all in the indictment, word for word. Why? Because our telephones suggested that we happened to be in Istanbul at the same time, or on certain occasions. They openly write in the indictment that they cannot put us together because since I'm a seasoned intelligence operative, I know how to conceal my moves, and I know how to conceal my moves. I mentioned this case because the authorities knew it was a sensitive case and it would attract considerable attention and scrutiny abroad, and yet they invented the evidence and could not even bother to hide it. If this is the kind of evidence prosecutors provide to get convictions in high-visibility cases, imagine what the rest of society has to endure. And there are many, many more such cases that I know about, and we have one here. 3 is the suppression of independent journalism and harassment of civil society. Here again, the role of the judiciary is central. It is a system of arrest first, investigate later, which translates often into long pre-trial incarceration time. The publication of allegedly false information, whether in a newspaper article or even in a social media post, can result in up to 3 years in prison if the content is deemed false by the presidency's Center for Countering Disinformation. Similarly, vague offenses of insulting the president can lead to imprisonment with the question of what constitutes an insult left to interpretation. And this is the government, the Ministry of Justice claims 31,000 investigations into alleged insults against the president were opened in 2020 alone. You think, they have something else to do in life? Since Erdoğan became president in 2014, this total has reached 160,000. Nearly 39,000 people stood trial for alleged crimes of insulting the president, and 3,600 defendants were sentenced to jail. So, but the problem is that the media landscape is heavily skewed in favor of the government. Much of the mainstream press is controlled by individuals or companies close to or sympathetic to the president. When targeted, opposition broadcasters risk more than fines or temporary sanctions. In some cases, they face the loss of their licenses, assets, and ability to operate altogether. I'll give you one other interesting case. It's a striking example of 2 prominent brothers, both well-known authors, intellectuals, journalists, Mehmet and Ahmet Altan, who were charged and detained on the extraordinary allegation that they had sent, and listen to this, they had sent subliminal messages on television in support of the 2016 coup. And they were detained for a long period of time. Eventually, the case is continuing. Number 4, increasing and routine practice of incarcerating elected politicians and other opponents. If you're a political leader, you end up in jail if Erdoğan perceives you as a threat. In the case of İmamoğlu, who mentioned earlier, he was arrested in March 2025. As the chairman said, the party's primary was scheduled to nominate him as a presidential candidate. He faces 142 separate charges in nearly 4,000-page indictment, with prosecutors seeking an aggregate sentence of 2,430 years, just in case he gets out in 1,000. It's not. Another case is Selahattin Demirtas, the very popular Kurdish politician who has been incarcerated for close to 10 years. and with his co-chair of the party, Figen Yüksekdağ. Demirtas was a political threat because Turkish Kurds had never had such a charismatic and capable leader emerge, and he was capable of throwing an election against Erdogan if he wanted. And he publicly chose to challenge the president. The European Court of Human Rights, and we will talk about this, I think, later, 3 times told Turkey to release him. The court rules, according to the Turkish constitution, are supposed to be obeyed, the European courts, and they just ignored it. In Turkey, the space for opposition has not been completely abolished, it just has been criminalized. Finally, number 5, the arbitrary removal of elected mayors through what they call the kayyum system or trustee system. What happens is that you get elected as mayor, and then 2 or 3 days later, or a week later, you get removed by the state on orders of Ankara, and you lose your position, and you get replaced by functionaries that the government appoints. So this system really erodes, and there's not been enough attention to the system. It really erodes democracy in 2 ways. First, it nullifies the elector's choice. Second, it appoints a state representative who not only fails to represent the party that won power, but also purges the winning party's members from municipal positions. It is far more sophisticated than banning the party. Now, I'll just give you the example of the mayor of Mardin, whose constituents clearly want him, elected him not once, but in 3 consecutive elections. And the government said, too bad, after 3 consecutive elections, removed him from office and replaced him by functionaries. And I know him, and the last time in 2024, when he was removed, he was this affable 82-year-old, and genuinely, he was accused of being a terrorist 3 times. Anyway, so this used to have only a Kurdish flavor. It was used against Kurdish mayors all over the country, but now it's also being used against the People's Republican Party, the main opposition party, because the main opposition party has suddenly shown that he has spine and muscle and is challenging Erdogan. And finally, what I'll say is Erdogan knows that he's unpopular, that he would lose free and fair elections. He has been in power since 2003, 23 years. So imagine if somebody is 30 years old, all they have seen is Erdogan. And now that you also have an opposition party that wants to take him on, he's going after them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rubin?
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Just under 1 year ago, I testified here about human rights in Turkey. I'm not going to repeat that testimony. Unfortunately, there's so much new to discuss. I'm reminded of the old Soviet joke about an optimist and a pessimist. The Soviet pessimist complains about how bad everything is: war, environment, economy, health. The Soviet optimist shakes his head and said, don't complain. Things could always get worse. So I'm here today as a Soviet-style optimist, but a real-world pessimist. Recep Tayyip Erdoğan has become emboldened with authoritarian consolidation. Every opposition leader has a target on his head. Every religious minority does as well. While Erdoğan and his henchmen have agency and are responsible for their abuses, frankly, they should also be Magnitsky Act responsible as well. What is frustrating is that Washington can put its finger on the scale to discourage rights abuses, but chooses not to. We saw this when even minor sanctions forced Erdoğan to reverse himself and release Pastor Andrew Brunson. Erdoğan blustered, but then scampered away like a street dog threatened with a wad of newspapers. There are two problems that are right now exacerbating Erdogan's behavior. First, the United States appears to give him free rein in exchange for Erdogan taking ownership over various crises in the region. This, however, rewards the arsonist. Second, Ambassador Tom Barak confuses ingratiation with success. This is a lesson that should have been learned after that infamous meeting between April Glaspie and Saddam Hussein in July of 1990, a few days before the August 2nd invasion of Kuwait. Rather than rehash my written testimony, in which I provide the more academic analysis, I'd like to use my limited time to focus on what the United States can do. First, the State Department and Congress should declare Selahattin Demirtas, Ekrem İmamoğlu, as well as Osman Kavala to be prisoners of conscience. They should demand meetings with them and make the accessibility of U.S. officials contingent. The White House might not comply, but the Turks are savvy enough to realize that no president has an unlimited tenure in the White House. Just as speaking out for Natan Sharansky and Andrei Sakharov had reverberations far beyond what we understood at the time, so too will be speaking out for Demirtas, İmamoğlu, and Kavala. That will put the United States on the right side of history. The State Department should also recognize Özgür Özel as the rightful leader of the CHP and sanction Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu if he does not recuse himself. Representative Smith, to underscore the importance of freedom and of speech and discourse, you had mentioned what had happened at Sheridan Circle. The United States, Washington, D.C., should install a plaque on Sheridan Circle commemorating the illicit attack on peaceful protesters in 2017. Second, genocide recognition matters for a simple reason. If the international community does not force states and groups to reject racist and genocidal ideologies, those ideologies persist. When regimes nature them, the dangers grow exponentially. We've seen this with Hamas and radicalized Hutus and Nigerians attacking Biafrans. While Turkey blusters, it folds when others recognize genocide. We saw this with both the Biden administration's recognition of the Armenian genocide, and that of all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Those recognitions happened, and Turkey didn't do a damn thing. Just as Erdogan now seeks a say in Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, and Jordan continues to assert some control there, so too should that model now apply to Greek and Armenian sites in Istanbul. We must recognize further that Jews are no longer safe in Turkey and should give asylum as needed before something truly horrible happens as a result of Erdogan's incitement. Third, Erdogan continues to use the supposed 2016 coup to justify repression. This will become even more true when the 10-year anniversary occurs next month. The facts, however, do not match his narrative. If Turks cannot ask questions, there is no reason why Americans should not state openly that we do not share Erdogan's preferred narrative to what appears to be a Reichstag fire. I have detailed some of these unanswered questions in my written testimony, but I'll go further right here, because like Henri, I have spurious charges pending against me in Turkey. I say here that if Turkey is really the tolerant democracy its diplomats and Tom Barak claim, I will go to Turkey to debate these issues to mark the anniversary of the coup. It would make for a good discussion, live streamed from the U.S. ambassador's residence. Fourth, and I realize controversially, the United States should push the peace process forward with the Kurds by releasing Abdullah Öcalan and ending the spurious designations against Kurdistan National Congress members. No Turkish leader was able to stamp out the PKK militarily, and so it is arrogant to believe they can do so now. Remember, the United States did not designate the PKK until 1997, and then only to conclude an arms deal. Delisting would enable Kurds to choose their own negotiators, and more importantly, allow the United States to mediate. We also need to audit the intelligence. Henri here spoke about how farcical the intelligence was in his designation. Well, given how much we've relied on Turkey as a NATO member, how far back should we trust that intelligence and take it at face value? We need to question what we received. Certain policy circles may find it fashionable to dismiss Turkey's dismal human rights scene as outside the parameters of US interests. But this is naive. Dictatorships never last. They always collapse into chaos. I would argue that the State Department needs to start planning for the day after in Turkey so that we can, once Erdogan passes, we can also put Erdoganism behind us, because there's not going to be human rights or peace in the region until Turkey is at peace with itself and its neighbors. Diplomacy never should be about amplifying foreign narratives. Rather, the strongest US foreign policies are those that are bipartisan and calibrated to reality rather than spin. Turkey is a growing problem. Ignoring it will lead to internal instability, if not regional conflict and war. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Rubin. Mr. Golga? Before we are joined by Gus Bilirakis from Florida. Gus is one of the leading authorities in the U.S. Congress on religious freedom, especially and including, I should say, Turkey. So I'm so glad he joined us. But I now yield to our distinguished witness.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and staff members, and Congressman Bilirakis, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to give my testimony here. I survived prison, but survival is not justice. I was hurt because people in this country chose to listen. Many others are still waiting for someone to hear them. This is not only about Serkan Gölge, it's about what happens when fear replaces law, when ordinary life can be turned into a terrorism case if the world stays silent. Implementation should not be measured only by action plans or diplomatic language. It should be measured by whether people receive real remedies, whether convictions are reopened, whether travel bans are lifted, whether families can rebuild civil life, and whether courts stop treating lawful association as terrorism. Without enforcement, rights remain words on paper. Most importantly, Congress should press Turkey to reform its terrorism laws so that terrorism requires actual violence, preparation for violence, or intentional support for violence. Terrorism law should never be stretched to punish lawful education, lawful banking, ordinary phone calls, downloaded apps, family ties, civil association, or a life later redefined as criminal evidence. The most basic principle of law is that a government may not retroactively convert lawful conduct into criminal evidence simply because political power later changes its meaning. I don't ask the United States to isolate Turkey. Turkey's people are not the enemy. Many are victims of the same machinery. I ask for enforcement. Congress and the United States government should use every available diplomatic channel. The State Department, the U.S. mission to the Council of Europe, European democratic governments, and direct engagement with Turkish officials to press Turkey to obey European Court of Human Rights rulings. Those rulings must lead to real remedies, retrials, releases where appropriate, restoration of civil rights, removal of travel restrictions, and end of prosecutions based on lawful association. Nearly a decade later, this cannot be explained as emergency confusion. Turkey has laws on paper, a constitution, and binding obligations under the European human rights system. The problem is not absence of legal standards, it's the absence of enforcement in political cases. For instance, in Yalçınkaya versus Turkey, the Grand Chamber of European Courts of Human Rights found that Turkey had convicted a teacher for terrorist membership without proving the basic material and mental elements of the crime. In plain English, an alleged app on a phone cannot automatically prove terrorism. Well, we did not come here instantly. The judiciary itself had been terrorized first. As my colleagues here mentioned several times, on July 16, 2016, Turkish Judicial Council suspended 2,745 judges and prosecutors on one night. The purge later reached more than 4,400. In a country where about half of the judicial branch could be labeled terrorist almost overnight, the message to those who remained was very clear. Do not act against the Turkish government's wishes, or you may be next. That is how fear entered the courtroom. Courts still existed, yes, but fear hollowed out their protective function. My case cannot be understood apart from Turkey's broader rule of law crisis. After 2013, and especially after 2016, judges, prosecutors, officers, journalists, civil servants, academics, teachers, doctors, and families were treated as terrorists because of association. Lawful schools, lawful banks, lawful publications, lawful networks, apps, phone calls, ordinary relationships became the raw material of terrorism files. The issue is not only my innocence. The deeper issue is the replacement of individual guilt with collective guilt. Even the final moment of leaving Turkey carried the fear of prison had planted on my children. When I was leaving the Turkish border in 2019, I was pulled aside for 40 minutes after 4 years of almost imprisonment. My wife and children started crying. My son held on to me and said, "No, Dad, not again, not again." That moment showed me that political imprisonment does not end when prison doors open. It lives inside families who learn to fear uniforms, checkpoints, and the possibility that a father may disappear again. My release also showed that the case was political. I was released from prison in May 2019 after high-level U.S.-Turkey diplomacy, but I was not free. Police watched my home. I wore a GPS ankle bracelet, and I had to report to the police. Public reporting linked my release to a call between President Trump and President Erdoğan, and President Erdoğan publicly referred me as a hostage. Months later, hours before President Erdoğan met President Trump at the White House, officers came to my house after midnight and removed the GPS bracelet and restrictions without explanation. If I was truly a terrorist threat, why did my restrictions rise and fall around presidential meetings? My wife and children, all American citizens, were not accused of any crime, yet they were prevented from returning to their home in Houston because of my case. My family lived the punishment with me. Prison also taught me that my case was not exceptional. I met teachers accused because of an app. A former judge also told me he did not even know why he had been arrested. And a one-star Army general who said he opposed the coup, but he was convicted because his name appeared on a list. Everyone around me asked how so many people could be arrested so quickly in one night. Even before the actual coup plotters were identified, the answer seemed clear to many of us. The lists were ready before the coup attempt. Prison turned this legal collapse into human suffering. I spent much of my imprisonment in isolation, about 23 hours a day alone. I don't describe prison to ask for your pity. I describe it because abstract legal errors become real people behind locked doors. When a court accepts so-called evidence, the result is not a theoretical mistake. It's a human life inside a cell. I was later convicted under terrorism laws, even though the courts did not prove violence, a weapon, an order, a hierarchy, a criminal instruction, and individualized intent. The accusation changed shape through the process, but the guilt survived. This is what happens when a profile-based story is given legal form. At first, I was held in police custody for approximately 13 days before formal arrest and questioned repeatedly about my private life, schools, newspapers I read, travel, my religion, contacts, my work in the United States, and the meaning of an alleged $1 bill. The pressure was not simply to tell the truth. It was to produce names that would fit a story already written. I had no names to give. I was not a spy. I was not a terrorist. I was a scientist. Anyone can make an accusation. The responsibility of police, prosecutors, the judges is to distinguish accusation from evidence. In my case, the state failed at that most basic duty. The burden was shifted onto me to explain why ordinary facts from my life were innocent. That is not criminal justice. The point is that I don't expect these members of committee to analyze every detail of my case, a dollar bill, a bank account, a NASA ID card. The point is that Turkey's legal system had reached a stage where such ordinary things could be treated as serious proof once the accused person fit a targeted profile. That is the logic of a witch hunt. First, myself, the person is marked, then ordinary facts from his life are collected and rearranged to justify the mark. Some of those facts were, and I wanted to show you this is only my indictment here, a NASA ID card and a $1 bill, because I was targeted first, and this was the reason that I spent 3 years in prison and 1 year in house arrest, a NASA ID card and a $1 bill. How do you explain that? The items treated as evidence against me included anonymous accusation that I claim working for NASA, but it was a cover for the CIA. My US citizenship, my education at a university associated with the Gulen movement, phone contacts, and a $1 bill. The names in my case are Turkish, but the logic is universal. Imagine this happening in the United States. Years after everything you did was legal, your college, bank account, family travel, phone calls, workplace ID, your Netflix account, your Costco membership, now it is used as evidence for terrorism. None of that proves violence, criminal intent, or participation in a conspiracy. But once the state marks you as an enemy, ordinary life can be arranged to look like a crime. That is how ordinary life becomes dangerous. First, the Turkish state placed a person inside a category. Then every detail of that person's life is interpreted through that category. Association becomes dangerous, not because it proves a crime, but that person becomes politically vulnerable. For me, the accusation did not begin with an evidence that I committed violence, planned a coup, carried weapons or orders, or joined an armed group. It began with an association. Someone later understood to be a very distant relative who had a dispute with my sister over inheritance claimed that I was suspicious because I had attended a school associated with the Gulen movement in 1998. Later, my lawyer told me something I never forgot. Serkan, you fit the profile. That sentence explained my entire case and all of the cases. I was a Turkish American, a NASA scientist, a US citizen, a graduate of a university associated with the Gulen movement. So the profile came first, the so-called evidence came later. In science, assumptions are not enough. Claims must be tested, evidence must be examined, conclusions must be justified. The painful irony of my case is that the legal system that imprisoned me did the opposite. It began with a conclusion and searched backward through my life for facts that could be arranged to support it. Before my arrest, I had built an ordinary life and a lawful life. I worked in physics in a space-related research connected with NASA Johnson Space Center. In 2013, so I traveled to Turkey with my family for a summer visit. That's all how it happened. I don't deny or minimize the violence of 2016 coup attempt. People were killed and wounded. And those responsible for violence should have been investigated and tried according to law. But that history must be told honestly in both directions. The coup attempt itself contained deeply suspicious and still unanswered elements. The Turkish government did not conduct a full, transparent investigation the public deserved about the coup attempt. Key figures were not meaningfully examined. key evidence was hidden or buried, and instead of providing individual responsibility, the government used that night as a pretext for mass punishment. A real coup attempt does not justify replacing individualized proof with collective guilt. I'm not here to relitigate my criminal file, but to show how a legal system can keep the appearance of courts while abandoning the substance of justice. What happened to me is one documented example of what happened to hundreds of thousands of people in Turkey. My case became visible because members of Congress, such as you, Congressman Smith, senators, journalists, scientists, colleagues, US officials, and eventually the White House refused to let it disappear. Many others remain invisible. Their names are not in international newspapers. Their families don't have senators calling attention to them. Their files move quietly, but the damage to their lives is just as real. I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Mr. Colgate, thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you for your courage and having suffered so much. And as you pointed out, not just you, but your family as well. Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Andrew O'Donoghue.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, honorable members, Türkiye'de insan haklarını isteyenler, hoş geldiniz. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about my research on Turkey's slide into authoritarianism. I'm a political scientist, and I conducted my doctoral research on Turkey, including 2 years on the ground and quantitative analysis of thousands of Turkish court decisions. My testimony to Congress today will make 3 main points. First, Turkey today is at a turning point from a system in which elections are unfair but still competitive to a system in which elections cannot produce political change. Second, the United States government has significantly scaled back its own support for human rights in Turkey. And finally, I'll identify 3 important ways in which the United States can step up to protect human rights in Turkey today. My first point is that Turkey today stands at a dangerous inflection point. Turkey is transitioning from competitive authoritarianism, a system in which elections are unfair but still winnable for the opposition, toward full authoritarianism, a system in which the opposition cannot win power at the ballot box. What is at stake is whether Turkey will be a country like Hungary or instead like Russia. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban was still able to lose and concede peaceful defeat at the ballot box even after 16 years in power. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin cannot be removed through peaceful elections. Since 2015, Turkey has been a textbook example of competitive authoritarianism. Turkey's ruling party, the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, has wielded its control over state institutions such as the judiciary to tilt the political playing field in its favor. Still, between 2015 and 2025, Turkey's government could still lose at the ballot box. In 2019, the opposition candidate for mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, defeated the AKP's candidate. When Turkey's highest election court nullified İmamoğlu's victory in order to rerun, İmamoğlu won again and increased his margin of victory by hundreds of thousands of votes. In the March 2024 local elections, İmamoğlu won re-election by over 12 percentage points, and the main opposition party, the CHP, surpassed the AKP's vote share for the first time this century. Simply put, until 2025, political competition in Turkey was unfair, but still real. Since early 2025, Turkey has veered towards full authoritarianism. As the ruling party's popularity has decreased, its use of repression has increased. In March 2025, Turkey's government arrested Istanbul Mayor İmamoğlu, who the opposition CHP selected as its candidate for the next presidential elections, and who consistently outperforms Turkey's president in opinion polls. İmamoğlu has been in prison since March 2025. A deepening judicial crackdown on Turkey's main opposition party, the CHP, has pushed Turkey further towards full authoritarianism. This May, a court in Ankara removed a leader of the opposition CHP and voided the results of a party Congress in 2023 that elected a new, young, and energetic leader, Özgür Özel, as the party's chair. Turkey's next presidential and parliamentary elections are due by May 2028. Under Turkey's constitution, President Erdoğan can only run for president again if he either calls early elections or changes the constitution to remove term limits. The judicial crackdown on Turkey's opposition increases the risk that Turkey's electorate will not be able to choose new leaders, even if public opinion were overwhelmingly in support of an opposition candidate such as İmamoğlu. My second point is that U.S. foreign policy toward Turkey has transitioned from limited support for democracy to increasing silence in the face of democratic backsliding. This shift in U.S. foreign policy is clear in the case of Istanbul's mayor, İmamoğlu. In 2022, when a Turkish court convicted İmamoğlu in a politicized case, the U.S. State Department expressed that it was deeply troubled and disappointed by that verdict. The State Department affirmed the United States' broader support for fundamental freedoms in Turkey, writing that we remain gravely concerned by the continued judicial harassment of civil society, media, political, and business leaders in Turkey. In 2025, when the same mayor was not only convicted, but also imprisoned, the U.S. State Department issued no such public statement. Just days after İmamoğlu's arrest, the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff described a phone call with President Erdoğan as great and transformational. Less than a week after İmamoğlu's arrest, Secretary of State Marco Rubio met his Turkish counterpart to discuss increased cooperation and made brief mention of concerns regarding recent arrests and protests in Turkey. In May 2026, this May, after a Turkish court removed the leadership of Turkey's main opposition party, the U.S. State Department did not issue a press release mentioning democracy, human rights, or other such concerns in Turkey. Just one day after the court's decision to remove the opposition party's leadership, our Secretary of State Rubio again met with his Turkish counterpart. However, the State Department's readout of the meeting makes no mention of democracy, human rights, or the court's decision against Turkey's political opposition. This shift in foreign policy, together with reduced financial, institutional, and rhetorical support for democracy, is part of a pattern that Professors Evren Balta, Oded Haklai, and I describe as a retrenchment of U.S. support for democracy. My final point is that this testimony, rooted in my research on Turkey, offers several policy recommendations that members of Congress can adopt to better protect human rights in Turkey. My first recommendation is to publicly monitor and condemn violations of human rights. As of April 2025, the United States government has scaled back the State Department's annual reports on countries' violations of human rights. Overturning decades of precedent, these reports will no longer condemn practices such as holding political prisoners, restricting free and fair elections, denying freedom of peaceful assembly, or harassing human rights groups. Consistent with long-standing State Department tradition, the United States should return to the practice of including and condemning state practices such as holding political prisoners in annual human rights reports. My second recommendation for Congress is to support independent media. Since 2025, the United States has curtailed its commitments to supporting independent media, both in Turkey and globally. In March 2025, an executive order moved to dismantle the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the parent organization of Voice of America, which has an estimated global audience of more than 360 million people. Since March 2025, Voice of America Turkish has not published any new reporting on Turkey. Consistent with our long-standing tradition, the United States should restore our support for independent media outlets. My third and final recommendation is to protect educational cooperation. Cooperation in the field of education has long been an anchor in U.S.-Turkey relations. The Turkish Fulbright Commission, which was created through a bilateral agreement in 1949, predates Turkey's accession to the NATO alliance in 1952. The Fulbright Commission has strengthened bilateral ties by creating a unique network of more than 5,000 alumni. Today, support for educational cooperation is under fire. The fiscal year 2026 Consolidated Appropriations Act reduced the budget for the U.S. State Department's educational and cultural exchange programs, including the Fulbright, by $74 million relative to prior year funding. Your support as members of Congress is essential to ensure that the United States protects human rights in Turkey by monitoring and condemning abuses of human rights, supporting independent media, and safeguarding educational opportunities for U.S. and Turkish students and scholars. Thank you, honorable members, for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you so very much, Mr. O'Donoghue. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Gus Bilirakis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You are truly a godsend, no question. Your focus on these issues, it means so very much to the people. Good morning, and a special thank you to co-chairs, as I said, the co-chair, Chris Smith, good friend, and James McGovern, for holding this hearing about the status of human rights in Turkey. I'm so glad to have such really an esteemed panel. I learned so very much just being here for a few minutes, and thank you for caring so very much. First question is for Henry Barkey. Turkey continues to impose restrictions on Christian institutions, including the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the continued closure of the seminary at Halki. I was able to visit the Halki Seminary, and it's appalling that it has remained closed for more than 5 decades, despite repeated international calls for its reopening. How do these restrictions affect the long-term viability of Christian communities in Turkey, and what specific diplomatic steps could the United States take to encourage Ankara to uphold internationally recognized standards of religious freedom? And if you can maybe give me an update on the status of the seminary, and then also maybe you can elaborate on Hagia Sophia as well. The question is for Mr. Barkey.
Congressman, the truth of the matter is that today there are very, very, very few Christians left in Turkey. So in a way, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think the Turks have managed over the years by pushing and creating obstacles, basically getting rid of the Christian minorities and also the Jewish minority. The problem is that for the Turks, there is this fear, there was always this fear that somehow the Greeks would come back and take Constantinople back from them. I mean, it's an unreasonable fear, and you can't really negotiate, argue with that. They will not listen to international demands on this issue. They don't really pay a price for it. Turkey is a vibrant country. I mean, in terms of tourism, etc., a lot of people go, and some people go to look at, try to see some of the ancient sites. But I hate to say this, Congressman, it's a lost cause. I'm being honest.
Well, let me, I'll never give up on this issue, but does anyone else want to comment on this, the religious freedom, the human rights, the Hagia Sophia, which is the first Christian church in the East, obviously, the largest for 1,000 years, obviously. It was an Orthodox cathedral, and then it was turned into a mosque, and then obviously, as you know, I don't have to tell you, museum and now mosque again. And any hope whatsoever after Erdogan leaves? Is there any hope whatsoever? What does the opposition party, what is their position on this? And how do the people, how do they feel? I know sometimes they don't want to speak out publicly because they know the consequences. What a real shame. But how do they feel, and what message can I relay to the administration? I know the president has spoken to Erdogan specifically about the seminary. So I was hoping I could hear if any progress has been made. Does anyone like to comment on that?
Congressman Bilirakis, if I may, I don't think we can discuss this issue without looking at the larger issue in Turkey. That's not just a Christian community issue. Unless we look at Turkish society and Turkish government's position from the perspective of the most general human rights and religious freedom perspective, this, just like Professor Barkey said, this is a lost cause. Why? Because Turkey is not just abusing the rights of those groups. At this moment, as I described, the abuse continues on many different forms and many different groups, not just that. So unless the United States Congress specifically ties the human rights pacts to any ongoing bilateral relationship, I don't see any reason why the Turkish government would do anything to further your request or agenda. You see, we have to look at this from the very general perspective. There's no religious freedom in Turkey. There is no, freedom of speech in Turkey right now. My recommendation would be, if the United States Congress, who has the power to do dealings with Turkey, we have to put those pacts, unless you respect the human rights laws. It's there. They're not respecting it. Just like Congressman Smith described and my colleagues described, all the laws are there. The European Courts of Human Rights rulings, which is the highest authority in Europe and Turkey, it's not binding for the Turkish government. It's not. For some reason, they ignore it, and they get away with it all the time. That's the only thing I can say.
Well, thank you for your honesty as well. Anyone else? I have one more question, if that's okay. But, sir, if you'd like to comment on that, that would be good.
Very quickly, and I see that Andrew does as well, so I'll be extra quick.
Okay, please.
First of all, I won't be defeatist here. Look, religious freedom in China, in North Korea, in Nigeria, wherever we're talking about, tends to be the canary in the coal mine, and it also tends to be the best metric by which we can judge whether there actually is political progress towards democratization or not. And so pressure does remain important, and certain elements can be reversed. That said, salami slicing shouldn't work with regard to islands in the South China Sea, and it shouldn't work with regard to religious freedom in Istanbul or anywhere else. One issue, though, in terms of salami slicing, beyond simply having restrictions lifted and the opening of the Halki seminary and so forth, which I talked about in my written and a bit in my oral testimony. We've seen a change in Turkish rhetoric over the last couple months, where they will now talk about the Turkish minority in Thrace and Greece. Now, in the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, that treaty defined the minorities in Greece as a religious minority, Greek Muslims. If we start following the Turkish precedent and the Turkish diction and refer to the minorities in Greece as, in ethnic terms, as Turkic, we're actually playing into the irredentism that Erdoğan has slowly been encouraging. And so you're absolutely right about the Hagia Sophia. You're absolutely right about the Halki Seminary and others, but I do want to point out that simply standing down and arguing it's too late only leads to more slices of that salami and a retraction of religious freedom.
As far as regime change, do you see any change? I mean, if there is a regime change, are there moderates that could take over in that particular, with regard to human rights and religious freedom? And like you said, we're playing into it.
Very quickly, I'm a pessimist here. Okay. And the reason I'm a pessimist is, and this is why I said in my oral testimony that we need to have a strategy to undo Erdoğanism, because Erdoğan has given a playbook for would-be populists, not only within the AKP, but also within the CHP, the Republican People's Party, which can sometimes be very illiberal. Now, Andrew has talked about the changes in the judiciary. We can look at a back-of-the-napkin calculation. More than 30 million Turks have gone through the school system completely under Erdoğan. We've seen a complete makeover and change in the character of the Turkish military, part of NATO. The fact of the matter is, every Democrat you know wakes up knowing when his last day in office is. Every dictator wakes up knowing that today could be his last day. But when Erdoğan dies, it's going to take a strategy to unwind all the damage that has been done to civil society. The only thing I can say with close to 100% confidence is that right now, the future president of Turkey, the future foreign minister of Turkey, the future head of intelligence is probably in a Turkish prison.
Yeah, it's awful. I have other questions, but I'm going to go ahead and yield. One more thing I wanted to say, this particular future legislation that you're aware of, eliminating the exclusive economic zone, what kind of an impact is that going to have on the region? I know this is a human rights discussion, but does anybody want to comment on that? Trying to codify this. Yes, please.
So the question is if a continuing populist Turkey's impact on the region, is that what you're asking? I couldn't hear.
The adjacent nation, yeah.
Look, there's no question that Turkey's role in the Middle East has been actually unconstructive. Right? It's partially driven by Erdogan's own interests. It's also, for Erdogan, the only card he has to play in the event of pressure at home is the nationalist card. So he's holding that one very close, and he uses it whenever it is necessary.
And
right?
it's
Whether it's in
effective.
Eastern
It's still
Mediterranean.
effective. It's still effective, is what you're saying.
Yes.
It's a nationalist card.
Yes, it is a very, look,
People do not read into it. Some do, but not enough.
no, because in Turkey, it's sometimes very difficult to stand up and say, take the Eastern Mediterranean, for instance.
Exactly.
You're not going to get the opposition party and say, no, we have to negotiate on the Eastern Med. There is a way out. They won't. And when it comes to the minorities, look, it's not just Erdogan's fault. The Republican People's Party, when it was in power, behaved as badly as Erdogan did today. Right? There's always been this fear of the minorities. Look, Turkey has a great future only if it manages to make peace, first of all, with the Kurds at home. That will change Turkish society. It will change what being really a citizen of Turkey means. At the moment, this is a country that's at war with itself, with its own citizens. So it can't deal with 20% of its own population. It's not going to, unfortunately, spend too much time worrying about a few thousand Christians. But in a Turkey that has made peace with the Kurds will be a very, very different place that we
You don't
won't
see that happening
recognize.
anytime soon. You don't see that happening anytime soon.
Well, time is relative, Congressman. 20 years from now,
Okay. God willing. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pilarakis. Just a couple of questions. You know, in 1998, I wrote a law called the Torture Victims Relief Act. It is current law through appropriations. I've reauthorized it statutorily a number of times. But I remember holding hearing after hearing and listening to prisoners of conscience and religious freedom all around the world talk about their harrowing experience at the hands of a dictatorship. I remember talking about Romania, because some of Europe was to Nicholas Ceausescu's Gulag state, Soviet Union, the Soviets. Frank Wolf and I went to Perm Camp 35, where there were many political and religious prisoners. That was in the 1980s. And there was like one common theme. Besides the physical damage done to people through sleep deprivation, implements of torture, the way Xi Jinping does it like no other in the world, with torture, that just is unbelievably despicable. There's also the PTSD problem, and these torture victims relief centers do center on trying to help them in their entirety. And there are some in Istanbul. We used to fund a number of them around the world. We still do. And so but you see what the aftermath is. And we do have a man testifying, obviously Mr. Golge, who was in prison. I don't know if you suffered physical torture. You certainly suffered psychological torture, as you pointed out in your testimony. You know, what it did, not just to you, but to your wife and your children, is unconscionable. And it's by design. They know, dictatorships and police states know that they do that, they get a certain outcome, and it might have a chilling effect on other people, particularly in country, speaking out. It's almost like all the judges. A fourth of all the prosecutors and judges were dismissed, as I think you pointed out earlier in Mr. Barkey. I mean, that has an impact on every other judge who looks at that and says, I better not step over certain bounds and do what Erdogan wants me to do. So but torture. I led delegations, one of them was to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly back in 2013. Of all things, Mark Milosh was the chief of staff for the Helsinki Commission at the time. And we were in Istanbul, I should say, for that meeting, and argued very vigorously on human rights for the host country, which they didn't like. But I brought up torture repeatedly. I do it at other assemblies where we would have a bilateral with the Turks, and you know, there's always the denial, and then somebody says, you know, you're right. How pervasive today under Erdogan is the use of torture? What impact has that had on people throughout the entire country who have suffered, you know, year in and year out of that kind of cruel mistreatment?
Physically, I was, however, left a lot of times sleep deprivation.
Right.
But right now, the main tool in Turkish government's arsenal is not so-called torture, but they literally take away your freedom under any sort of like so-called evidence. So that's like my colleagues here, as they mentioned many names, like presidential candidate İmamoğlu or others, it starts with just an anonymous tip. It always like that. Once they target someone, it always starts with a tip, anonymous tip, or any sort of like thing. They start looking at their ordinary life, and that has become the way of torture itself. I think that would be, because when you take away somebody's life, their years, their freedom, that I would really call that as a torture as well. Not just that person, on their family, on their kids, and the fear that I told this myself many, many times. I'm not getting out of here. I don't know, alive or dead, but I'm not getting out of here. So that's a bit of a psychological torture, isn't it?
Yes, please.
Congressman, first, thank you for your work on the Torture Victims Relief Act. I think, building on Mr. Golge's comments, Congress does have policy options available to both mitigate the use of torture and to support survivors of torture. And what the Turkish example shows historically is that working with and supporting professional associations, especially doctors and lawyers, is a particularly effective means of fighting torture even in difficult circumstances. So in Turkey in the 1990s and 2000s, a concerted effort was made to mitigate and reduce torture, including through the Torture Victims Relief Act. One very valuable mechanism was working with doctors and lawyers. Torture often leaves visible signs. Doctors in Turkey were trained to recognize and to report those signs as a matter of their professional obligation. Lawyers, similarly, who meet with defendants can be trained to both recognize and to report the signs of torture. The United States government, through its support for civil society in Turkey and globally, can work with professional associations to recognize and to encourage reporting of the telltale signs of torture to enhance our work through the Torture Victims Relief Act. The last thing I'll mention, in addition to Mr. Golge's comments, is that torture is often distributed regionally or sort of unequally, less pervasive often in big cities, but more pervasive in regions such as the southeast of Turkey, where militarization and monitoring of torture is weaker. So There's many options available, including working with professional associations, but targeting relief for torture victims to areas that are most affected.
Yes, Mr. Rubin.
I would just say very, very quickly, it's clear that in the future, given the cycle which Henri has talked about as well, where in the past the JHP has also engaged in abuses, that there needs to be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the United States should be supportive of that. There should be discussion now as to the shape which that should take, as we've had models in South Africa most famously, but also in Morocco. We've had models after the anti-Tutsi genocide in Rwanda, and perhaps in discussion with those who have suffered inside Turkey and managed to escape, we can talk about what the best way forward in a bipartisan sense would be to help fund and craft a reconciliation and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
That is a great idea, because it was also very helpful in El Salvador, because I was very much involved with that, not, in a tangential way, but it was very, very important. Mr. Rubin, you mentioned that today, like so many dictators before him, Erdogan has found anti-Semitism a useful tool to divert attention and sidestep accountability from his own failures. And you also said I do not say this lightly, but the time has come for Jews to leave Turkey. Could you elaborate on that anti-Semitism?
It is always a low-cost option for dictators, for very short-term political reasons, to engage in incitement. The problem with incitement is once they have engaged in it, it is almost impossible to cleanse society of the results of that incitement, and oftentimes that incitement takes a momentum of its own. What I worry about now when I read Yeni Shafak, or when I read Yeni Akit, or any of the other newspapers which Erdogan seems to trust, is that the question is going to be less what Erdogan or Ibrahim Kalin or whomever says about, or Hakan Fidan says about any particular issue, and more what the lone wolves, the generation of lone wolves which Turkey is now creating, will engage upon. And because the Jews are such a minority, because there's now a diplomatic overtone with regard to growing tensions with Israel, I'm afraid that something very, very bad could happen. And just the very fact that those inside Turkey would blame the Jews as being fifth columnists somehow for Israel illustrates what second-class citizens they have become. Now, the other danger in Turkey, unfortunately, we're already there, and that's the museumification of minorities, religious minorities. We see this in Azerbaijan all the time. And when I used to go to Iran, I would see it in the Islamic Republic of Iran, where you would be taken to a church or taken to a synagogue, and there would be the standard dog and pony show, which a representative would give, and only the most naive would expect that to be the truth. We're already in that situation with the Jewish community, I would argue, inside Turkey. But I very, very much worry that this is taking on a momentum of its own, and there doesn't seem to be either a will or a way to close Pandora's box.
If I could, as you all know, oh yes, did you want to comment on it? Mr. Orkay?
I'm actually, I was born in Turkey, I'm a Jew, and knew that very early on in my life I was going to leave Turkey. This was way before Erdogan came to power. The thing about Erdogan is that he has, like he's the student of a Turkish politician called Necmettin Erbakan, who really created Erdogan. And Erbakan was a real unabashed anti-Semite. Everything that came out of his mouth every day was anti-Semitic. Erdogan learned how to contain that, especially in the first few years of his rule, where he actually opened up to not just the Jewish community in Turkey, but Jewish communities everywhere in the world, and then turned on them. And what is interesting is that one of the great accusations he has against Osman Kavala is that Osman Kavala was an ally of that Hungarian Jew, George Soros. Right? That in of itself was, so there is, in the Turkish press, especially the Erdogan press, is full of, Turkish Jews, unfortunately, there are actually more Turkish Jews still in Turkey than there are Christians, but they also are on their way out. And it's on, as I said earlier, I really think Turkey needs to do maybe what Michael is suggesting, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but something, it has to cleanse itself. But it is also, we should not ascribe everything to Erdogan because some of these things were already there before. He just exacerbated them.
With the upcoming Turkish Istanbul, or Ankara summit, I should say, for NATO, on July 7th and 8th, NATO will convene a meeting there. Secretary of State Rubio suggested today that our president will be attending. And you know, there's obviously big issues with NATO. Ukraine and Iran are certainly at the forefront, but the host obviously, you know, has not been helpful on so many things. His friendship with Russia is bewildering, although they do provide him with some military capability, which has led to us conditioning some of our military sales. But let me ask you, what would be your recommendation to Marco Rubio and to the president? It's very, you know these issues better than anybody. Going to Ankara to a NATO summit, with regards to human rights. I mean, I believe that the Magnitsky sanctions need to be used far more robustly everywhere, not just in Turkey, and religious freedom, CPC status ought to be meted out for Turkey. It took a while, but we finally got it for Nigeria. Unfortunately, we lost it during the Biden administration. And while Christians are being slaughtered all over Nigeria, and I've been there many times. So we're dealing with a situation here where, you know, there are people who clearly should be sanctioned under Magnitsky and are not in Turkey. So your thoughts on, you know, your advice to the president and to the Secretary of State and to our military as they travel to Ankara?
Well, the truth is, I would not have gone in the first place. I think it's a huge mistake to go because you're rewarding essentially Erdogan. I mean, whether you're Republican or Democrat, I mean, the Biden administration essentially ignored, or very obviously ignored, Erdogan, never invited him to Washington, and he really fulminated about that. He was really angry. But unfortunately, under this current administration, we seem to be rewarding him, and he hasn't been helpful. I mean, remember, the one thing, I mean, the Middle East is today, the mess it is, in large measure of what happened October 7th, right? Basically, Erdogan thinks that Hamas is a liberation organization, did not criticize what happened on October 7th, right? This is not shall we say, behavior that should be acceptable. You may still like the Palestinian cause. This is not an issue about the Palestinian cause, but something happened October 7th that was awful, and he could not bring himself to criticizing it, right? And that's where it starts, essentially. And he's gotten away with it, and now we are rewarding him. So there's nothing, I think, what is it that the President and the Secretary of State can do once they're there? If they go to a church or to a synagogue or to it will be just a photo op. It will not it will not be much. I mean, I can spend some time and think about if there was a really, should we say, symbolic act that could be done. Yes, but would our leadership do it? I don't know.
I mean, the release of certain prisoners, the former mayor of Istanbul, there were things that could be done that would, we know that when he met with Xi Jinping, we tried very hard, and I know he did it. The president did it with Xi Jinping, asked that Jimmy Lai, for example, be released. I know Marco Rubio was very much a part of that, and unfortunately, in his obstinacy, Xi Jinping in China did not do it. But that has to stay. We got to keep pushing, and that's how you get prisoners out, hopefully. So I'm just, if there were a group of, high-profile things that are actionable that can happen, maybe some good could come out of this. Yes.
Turkey's government, as you pointed out, Congressman, wants certain things from the U.S. government. They want defense and military cooperation. They want increased economic ties. They want high-level recognition, including Oval Office visits with our president. The United States has the capacity to speak up for the shared values that we embody in the NATO alliance, including a commitment to fundamental tenets of democracy and to condition those things that Turkey wants out of the bilateral relationship on increased progress on human rights. Those include standing up for judicial independence in the cases of Ekrem İmamoğlu and Özgür Özel, speaking up for journalists, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, who have been imprisoned in Turkey, asking for meetings with political prisoners, including prisoners of conscience and members of religious and ethnic minorities. The Turkish government wants cooperation with the United States, and it is within our capacity as a democracy to condition the bilateral cooperation on increased movement by the Turkish government towards protecting human rights and democracy.
Congressman, if I may, I know for a fact when he was a senator, at the time, Senator Rubio was a champion alongside you for my release. So if I were to ask him, I would say, what changed? I know it's politics. I'm not a politician, like a political science like my colleagues here, but at least I would ask him, what changed? Why we are leaving the fundamental human rights, why we are leaving this policy behind, why? Why can't we do it both at the same time? Cooperate with Turkey, but force them to obey fundamental rule of law, fundamental human rights. Why can't we do? So I would ask this question to him, and I would support him when they go to Turkey. Would I be so naive to ask this and request them to ask this question, to their counterparts? What happened? Why Secretary Rubio is not supporting the fundamental human rights in Turkey anymore? And just like my colleagues here mentioned, every time they make a dealing with Turkey, I think that's a great recommendation that they would tie this to obeying rule of law and democratic rulings.
If I may say briefly, I tend not to be as positive towards the transaction because the flip side of that would be rewarding Turkey for bad behavior in the first place, essentially ransoming hostages. But I do understand. Now, before Peter Rodman passed away, the draft speeches of Ronald Reagan's Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, were released. They were declassified. And what was clear was that Peter Rodman, as a speechwriter and aide, had tried to excise that rhetoric from Ronald Reagan's speech. And I had the opportunity to talk to Peter about it, and Peter said it was a mistake. And his attempts to dilute that moral clarity was a mistake. And it really is a lesson I wish some of our diplomats would learn. Instead of saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, it would be great to have a prominent American say, Mr. Erdoğan, tear down Silivri, the main political prison. And if we, for political reasons, are not able to do that, it would be useful behind the scenes if some of those who aren't able to say that with moral clarity would perhaps convince some of our European allies, our NATO allies, to do that. Because Turkey, on one hand, Turkey looks at this as an endorsement of Erdogan's rule. But at the same time, we don't need to defer the narrative to Turkey. And while the world's press is on Turkey at this NATO summit, it behooves us either directly or behind the scenes to take that narrative and change the nature of the debate about democratization and repression and autocracy inside Turkey.
Regrettably, we have 3 minutes left on the vote that has been called, and I apologize because I have some additional questions, and I would love to hear further from all of you. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I thank you for pouring so much into one of 19 pages, for example. Mr. Rubin, thank you for that. All of you, I think, extensively have outlined the who, what, when, why of the entire issue, and it will help all of us, and we will obviously be in touch with the administration. We'll try to work with the administration, and I think the most immediate thing is this NATO summit that's upcoming, and trying to get some satisfaction there with raising it. Tear down the wall, that's a great remembrance of just how bold that was, and I remember it like it was yesterday. So I want to thank you so much, and without any further ado, the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.